Well, thank you guys for being here. Thank you for taking a moment to listen to my presentation. I know that you guys have heard a lot of presentations so far that have been, I'm sorry to the camera person, I move a lot, so my apologies.
No, it's okay.
I am going to give you guys a little break from the numbers to just look at a theory paper, okay? My paper is titled, When and Why Servants Lead and Leaders Serve, okay? Let's start with kind of a classic. If you're in the room, you've probably heard this quote 100 times, right? The servant leader is servant first, as Leo was portrayed, right? So we know the story of Leo, right? First off, the servant leader is servant first. The servant has a natural feeling that they want to serve and to serve first. This person is sharply different from one who is a leader first. Now, when we've seen this quote before, we typically focus on servant leadership being servant first, right? This idea that a servant leader is a servant, right? Very simple, very accessible concept. But interestingly, nobody seems to really pay attention to the second half of what we're saying, what Greenleaf has mentioned. That there are people, right? And we all, especially you practitioners, know this. There are people who are leaders first. And then they consciously choose to engage in service as they develop their leadership capacities, right? Interestingly, there's not much in the literature on how a leader develops into a servant leader. There's not much about how somebody who is already enacting leadership might start to look more like a servant leader, like what we're talking about, and enact those types of behaviors. So that's the focus of my research. I want to know, first off, in technical language, what are the antecedents, right? That's the technical term, but really what we're saying is, okay, if you're saying you're a servant leader, what does that really mean? How did you become a servant leader? Were you a leader who started serving? Or were you a servant who took on the role of a leader, who stepped into leadership? So this is the main distinction that we want to look at, okay? Now, I am taking an identity-driven perspective. Not all of the literature in servant leadership is about identity. In fact, very little of it is. Peter Sun, if you're interested in the identity questions, is probably the main author who talks about servant identity. And we'll get into that in a second. And then we also have the leader identity, which if you're interested in that, you can look to a paper called by Drew and Ashford. They're the kind of main folks who talk about the development of a leader identity. So we're going to look at these two identities, and start to ask ourselves, why would somebody who has one take on the behaviors indicative of the other, and why would somebody who has the other take on the other behaviors that are indicative of perhaps the servant leader? So I will start kind of with a crash course pretty quickly to go through these because we only have 15 minutes, and I have a timer going and I'm already 3 minutes in. And so we'll quickly move through each of these individually, and then we'll get to the question of how do they work together? How do you start seeing the pieces come together, right? How do you help a servant step into leadership like Ian was talking to us about yesterday? Or how do you see somebody who is a leader actually start to enact, the opposite. How do you see somebody who is a leader start to enact service? Yeah. All right, so before we get too far, let's just lay the groundwork. Now, identity is a messy literature. For those of you who are in the room who are scholars, you know a lot of people will tell you, don't touch identity with a 10-foot pole, right? You'll hear this a lot in the literature because identity's got a lot of camps. It's got people who think a lot of different things. So when I say identity work, here's what I mean, okay? And here's what the literature would support for authors like Hannah et al., right? And even what Peter Sun's written on servant identity, right? What it means is that people start with certain attributes, right? They have attributes, they have dispositions, maybe even the social context has created certain types of relationships, and they take on a certain type of cognition, right? They start to think like, for example, a leader or a servant, right? And as they develop those cognitions, they become perceptions, appraisals, things like that, they're going to find opportunities to act in alignment with those types of cognitions. And these are conations. Hannah et al. Is really the only author who's going to use this language, but conations really captures the idea of both your motives and your actions. Okay, so we're going to use those together because we're talking theory here. We're going to bring out the level of abstraction a little bit more, and so that's where we're going to land at conations. And then typically this is going to have some sort of feedback mechanism, right? Over time, people are going to be exposed to our conations. They're going to be exposed to us acting as a servant and as a leader, and they're going to react to them. All right, so first off, servant identity development. Well, Peter Sun gives us 4 different attributes that are going to influence somebody towards becoming a servant, right? Calling, humility, empathy, and agape love. Okay? So we in our work are just going to take those at face value. We're going to build and stand on the shoulders of giants, so to speak. Take these attributes, and I think that that's an interesting conversation in and of itself. We don't tackle that perhaps in our paper, but we're going to build straight off of his work already in this space. But then the next piece is, these folks need to actually recognize opportunities, right? They need to recognize opportunities to act in a way that is aligned with their moral values. And to do that, according to Hannah and colleagues, already again an established idea, they need to have moral complexity, the capacity to recognize complicated moral decisions and unpack them, figure out how to deal with them. And they have to have metacognitive ability. What does that mean? It means that you can think about your thinking, right? You don't just make decisions, but you reflect back and you say, how did I make that decision? What went wrong? What went right? That kind of thing. And so we find that these servant attributes and the abilities to kind of go through this process are going to help you to think like a servant. And when you think like a servant, research shows then you're going to start probably acting like a servant, right? Relatively intuitive. Now, the next piece is going to be leader identity development. Now, leader identity development, you could say a ton of things that are indicative of the leader. And so what we've chosen to do here is we've chosen to focus on just what the literature already says about things that are associated with leaders, right? So leader prototypicality. That's where we get Lord et al., for example. These are some characteristics, some attributes that stand out as kind of a typical person who's going to be recognized or seen as a leader. If you have these types of these attributes or abilities, you're probably going to be recognized by the people around you. As a leader, you're going to be pushed towards leadership, those kinds of things, right? So no surprise, these folks are going to be recognized by their peers, perhaps, and their peers might say, hey, James, you're really good at this. I'd love to follow you, right? Or, hey, James, have you ever considered being a leader? Have you ever considered stepping up and maybe taking some of your skills, some of your strengths that I see, and starting to do that for us? And so that's the opportunity that we see with the identity granting and identity claiming, right? Some people might actually claim, hey, I want to follow you, and I want to put myself in that position, or I might want you to lead me, okay? And so that's going to be what we mean by recognition here. Again, straightforward. If you have these attributes, if you have these capacities, if you're recognizing these opportunities, you're going to step into thinking more like a leader. Start putting on your leader hat, so to speak. And eventually you'll find the opportunities, or be given the opportunities, to enact leadership, to step into that, right? Be put into the department chair position, right? Absolutely. Okay, so this is the basics. Now, we'll go one layer farther into some of what I think is interesting now for us to talk about. How does somebody get from being a servant to a servant leader? How does somebody get from being a leader to a servant? So first off, leadership as a means of service. So, say you are a servant already, or you think like a servant, you act like a servant. The servant conation process, this motivation, this action, this intent to serve, is going to predispose people to develop leadership conations, okay? To want to act like a leader. And we believe this for 3 reasons, okay? And you'll see these 3 reasons throughout the entire presentation. They're based on Chan Drasgo's idea of 3 motives to serve, which Ian actually mentioned a few times yesterday with non-calculative motivation to serve, or motivation to lead, rather. And so these are going to kind of line up with those. First, somebody might want to participate and support others' growth and flourishing, right? They might be invested in saying, hey, I want to come alongside you, right? They might be interested in maybe multiplying their impact. They see the opportunity to lead as a way to serve more people. Hey, if I can get Ben, if I can serve Ben, just like we just talked about, is going to become more of a servant himself. He's going to then serve other people. Look at the service impact I'm able to have here. So I want to be a leader because I can multiply my effects. Or third, they might be fulfilling a responsibility. This is going to be social normative more so, right? There might be a certain sense, if you're a servant, that you're obviously, surely going to be the kind of person that would step up when someone needs a leader, that would maybe share some good ideas of how to move forward. Hey, I've been there before. Let me maybe help you. Let me coach you. Let me cast a vision for where we could go. So you might feel a certain sense of obligation that this is a way you could serve. Now, I have 2 asterisks here. first thing, and this is actually the reason why it's in italics, is because, well, this first one is in italics, is because this is not something that's currently in the paper, but it is something that we've gotten from reviewer feedback and thought about already and just don't have space for currently. If you don't think you're a good leader and you're a servant, it wouldn't be very servant-like of you to then go and try and lead. All right? You might cause a mess. And so we think that there's a good chance that you really need to believe that you can contribute. Or if you don't believe that already, go out and find the help, the support that you need to develop those skills, right? So this is likely going to be a contingency that we'll have to deal with or address. Another piece here that we do currently theorize is that the social context is going to play in heavily here, right? If you are a servant and you're in a certain type of culture, national culture or organizational culture, like Bob's work in the serving culture, those social contexts are going to play a heavy role in whether you choose to enact leadership. Okay? All right, let's take time. I'm going to keep moving. Next, what about if you are a leader? And this one I found actually to be the most challenging. Leaders, why would a leader ever choose to start serving? And I'm curious, and I'd love to discuss at our table, if you buy what I've got here, or what we've come up with. Leaders every day are faced with moral decisions. Why? Because their decisions have implications for a broad array of stakeholders, and a broader and broader array over time. It grows, right? And so those decisions are fundamentally moral. They're going to have implications not only for the people that they serve or that they're working with, that they're leading, they're going to have implications for families, for communities, for organizations. And so immediately they're going to be exposed as a leader to the implications of those actions. What are they going to do with it? How are they going to respond to the realities of their decisions having implications on other people? Well, there are a few things that I think are important here. First off, motives for leading. Why would they want to lead? Is it because they have a social normative motivation to lead? They feel a certain sense of duty or obligation. They have to lead. I gotta be a leader. Perhaps it's an affective identity motivation to lead. I just feel like a leader. That's just my personality. I love to take charge. I get a vision in my head and I just want to help people kind of accomplish it. Or lastly, maybe non-calculative. They don't really think about the costs to themselves. They're more just focused on other people. They see an opportunity, they see something that's of value, and they say, I want to go after that, without any real consideration necessarily for the burden it's going to place on them or the costs they might incur. The other thing you need to think about here is normative philosophies. Now, if you're familiar with Jim and Chad's work on normative philosophies and their connection to the different ethical forms of, moral forms of leadership, you'll know that we have deontology, virtue ethics, and utilitarian consequentialism, which are associated with different types of moral leadership. And so I believe that when we pair these together, we get some interesting implications. First, if you have a social normative motivation to lead, you lead because you feel a certain sense of obligation or duty. This is aligned with the kind of underlying principles of deontology. What deontology says is, I lead because it's something normative, because there's a standard, because there's perhaps some sort of guiding philosophy, some sort of guiding wisdom or something that I feel like I need to put myself under. Right? Deontology is fundamentally about, hey, I believe that this is truth and therefore I live according to that truth. And so we would suggest that this would naturally lend itself to more of a social normative motivation. Second, if you have virtue ethics, right? We know from this work before that virtue ethic is associated with authenticity, this authentic expression. So perhaps we're more likely to see that leaders are going to have an affective identity-based motive to lead if they have this virtue ethic kind of cognition, right? And lastly, utilitarian consequentialism. This care and concern for other people, right? We would expect this, of course, to be associated with non-calculative, where you think to yourself, I don't care as much about the implications on me, I'm more focused on the opportunity to serve an array of stakeholders. And so we would suspect that people who are going to land in this last camp, who are motivated to lead primarily out of their interests for other people, are going to be driven towards servant leadership in particular through their service conations. The other two are likely going to develop moral forms of leadership, but perhaps not servant leadership. And so I'm curious, I'd love to have some discussion with you guys on that in particular. This is something we've really been hashing out and thinking about. Lastly, multiple identities. Now you might be sitting in here and you might be saying, well, Daniel, don't you know, people have more than just one identity. They're not just a servant, they're not just a leader, they're more than that. And the reality is you're right. People tend to have combinations of different identities. And we would suggest there are definitely circumstances where people might have a leader and a servant identity. And so what do we do with that? Well, first off, if you have a leader and a servant identity, these can have three different ways that they relate to each other, according to the literature. If you're interested in this, Mateo and Vogue, and I know I'm saying those names wrong, have a wonderful paper where they flesh this out. And they identify three different ways that identities kind of coalesce or relate to each other. They might be synergistic. In other words, the demands, values, and goals of those identities, they work very much with one another. We would expect that if you have a non-calculative motivation driving your leader identity. Why? Because that motivation is fundamentally aligned with what would motivate somebody to be a servant, caring for other people's interests, not really focusing on oneself and the cost that it's going to be. Alternatively, if you have an affect identity-based motivation to lead, it might be compatible with a servant identity if the person is perceived to be, if service is perceived to be an authentic expression, right? And so I actually work, one of the co-authors in this paper is Mitch Newbert, and Mitch is a big believer in virtue ethic. He asked the question, well, if I'm virtuous, couldn't that be at least compatible with being a servant leader? And I would say that that's the case, and this would probably be why. That you're truly living out an authentic expression, and you have both in your kind of your sense of self, for simplicity, and these are going to then be compatible. Third, if you have social normative, the question becomes, okay, well, what is the normative environment, and is that aligned with you being a servant leader? If the environment around you is conducive to serving, for example, like Bob's paper about serving culture, if you're in an environment that says, hey, serving is great and supported, then that would be expected. But one of the questions we have still is, when do they conflict? And naturally, of course, you could just take the antithesis of these, say, if it's not an authentic expression and your motivation to lead is driven by this authenticity that we see in affective identity motivation to lead, or if the culture is against it, then perhaps we would see that would be conflicting. But what other circumstances are these going to be in conflict? And those of you who are practitioners, I'd love your perspectives on that. When do they actually bump heads? When does serving and leading bump heads? All right. Cut to the chase. What are we doing here? Well, my aim is to go beyond what the literature already has said, what the theory already says about serving and leading. To not just look at serving, which is the temptation of us as people who are passionate about servant leadership. We're passionate about it typically because of the serving element. But how do we see these things coming together? That's the big question we want to tackle. I think that there are practical implications for how we develop leaders, right? When you're in an organization, how do you take somebody who's a leader and make them a servant leader? Or how do you take somebody who's a servant and say, hey, I want to cultivate you to become a leader? Those are the two things that we want to look at in terms of practical implications. And then there's questions here about how does this sustain, right? What are the feedback loops? What are the mechanisms that cycle back and make servant leadership enactment be something that somebody continues to do because they see it as something that's profitable or good? Or somebody might experience the opposite, where the feedback loop and the process actually kind of fizzles out. So we're curious about that. I think that future research will benefit from it. These are the questions. Feel free to take a picture. Thank you guys for your time. Yeah, I look forward to discussion.